This year marks the centennial anniversary of National Women's Suffrage. Now, make no mistake about it, women's suffrage is perhaps the single most important political transformation of the past century. It is so monumental, in fact, that we cannot even imagine a world today where suffrage is limited to men. To most of the students I teach, the very idea seems silly. And to many of these same students, the ratification of the 19th Amendment has that feel of inevitability. But was it? The strange thing about inevitability is that it only becomes clear with hindsight. To the people living through historic times, it hasn't happened yet, and it is never certain when or how we get to that final step. This should be apparent today. We are smack in the middle of national protests and demands for racial justice, and for the first time in history, large percentages of the American people want to see real reform. It must have felt this way in 1916. In hindsight, of course, suffrage appears to be a fait accompli. Women had already won the vote in 13 states. The House of Representatives was about to seat its first woman, Jeannine Rankin of Montana. Women were appointed to commissions by powerful men. They had extensive education. They led progressive reform efforts. Even anti-suffragists somehow proved the case. The Antis, as they were called, were oftentimes all-female organizations. They refused association with men. They raised significant amounts of money. They were tightly organized and brutally effective at lobbying. Women were everywhere in the early 20th century. It must have seemed only inevitable that they would somehow, someday, vote anywhere and everywhere. But of course, that is just the problem. Despite a campaign that had spanned 2 generations of activists, women still did not have a universal right to vote. The story I want to tell today is about the final passage and ratification of the amendment. It's a story that defies an easy moral, but I think a fitting one as we think about democracy in 2020 in an election year. We begin in 1915 with a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt. Carrie Chapman Catt had just assumed the presidency of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was a sprightly 56 years old, and no one knew better than her about the difficult road ahead. After all, it was her second presidency. She had already given 1 lifetime to women's suffrage before the death of her husband and short retirement. She was about to give another. Carrie Chapman Catt was a worldly woman, a smart woman. She could match anyone for wits and refinement, and she could brawl with the best of them. She took the long view. As a second-time president, she was aware of the need for organization and for organizational focus. The strategy that she utilized, and it was a controversial one within her society, was to continue focusing efforts on the state suffrage amendments. The more women who voted in states, she reasoned, the more states that signed on to the cause, the more inevitable a national amendment would be. There were many who felt that this was a surrender and that they should make more direct efforts on Congress. That was actually the second part of Carrie Chapman Catt's strategy. Behind the scenes, she organized direct lobbying of representatives and senators, doing the busy work of convincing them to make common cause with suffragists. Carrie Chapman Catt ran a tight ship, and this rankled some of the younger members of the suffrage movement. Most famously, the young and magnetic suffragist Alice Paul ended her association with the suffrage party over its conservative tactics. When Catt's vision of a traditional political campaign began, Paul founded her own party of militants. Alice Paul was barely 30, and she had been radicalized in England, where feminists there had showed her the value of using militant tactics to raise awareness. She brought back an appreciation for the power of political theater. This was not an appreciation that Carrie Chapman Catt shared. Catt preferred to lead by building political alliances, by gaining allies, by being better organized and better funded. Now, Catt also knew the value of publicity and relished controlling the message in the media. And in fact, the New York Times reported that, under Mrs. Catt's rule, the suffragist machine had been perfected. And 1916 was an election year, and it was a hard year politically for women's suffrage. The New York referendum had failed the year before. The Antis seemed to have the upper hand. Republicans had endorsed women's suffrage, but it was the Democratic candidate who had won the November elections. Woodrow Wilson was headed back to the White House, and he opposed a national amendment. It was a states' rights issue, said Wilson. Each state should decide for itself. Mrs. Catt may have possessed a perfect suffrage machine, but that machine was stalled out. Enter Alice Paul. Having hardly been noticed by the national media before, she now put into effect an audacious plan. On January 10th, 1917, she and her radicals organized militant suffragists literally into military companies. Newspaper reporters noted that a company of these suffragists marched across Lafayette Square under the command of a Miss Mabel Vernon. They posted themselves at each of the gates to the White House and stood there all day without speaking, bearing banners that read, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" They were called the Silent Sentinels. On January 10th, Woodrow Wilson first arrived at the White House around 10 a.m. He was returning from a game of golf, and he arrived in a sedan motor car. The car drove past the gates and past the protesters, and that was that. When asked if the president had even smiled when he passed by, one of the Silent Sentinels told the press, "Not so you would notice." Even the appearance of such ungallant behavior may have bothered Wilson, a Virginian who spent his childhood and adolescence in Augusta, Georgia, but he would make up for it. The morning of January 11 brought freezing winds down on the White House. The Silent Sentinels nonetheless kept their posts. They had to organize frequent reliefs to bring people in from the cold, and they used hot bricks wrapped in newspapers to help their guards stand the cold weather. President Wilson took pity and sent out a messenger inviting the suffragists in for shelter. But it was the Silent Sentinels' turn to snub the president. The national press couldn't take their eyes off the scene. They seemed awed by these young militants marching in formation and refusing to take no for an answer. No socialist would try this tactic, said the New York Times. Why? Because the socialists are men, and men's minds may be wicked, virtuous, wise, or foolish, but they are not made so they would work in just this way. They would feel the absurdity and futility of it. Not a flattering review, to say the least. But the ground was about to shift under everyone's feet. Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war," but that's a little disingenuous. The United States had been supplying the British for some time, and the Germans were more than aware. Their submarines had targeted American ships that had supplied Great Britain, most famously the Lusitania in 1915. And in 1917, the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a coded telegram to the German ambassador to Mexico, instructing him to suss out the possibility of Mexico making war on America in exchange for German help regaining territories lost in the Mexican-American War. It was intercepted by the British and decoded, and then shared with Woodrow Wilson about 2 months after the Silent Sentinels had begun their picketing campaign. It was promptly leaked to the press, and the context of the fight for women's suffrage was about to change. Carrie Chapman Catt knew what she had to do. In fact, she had anticipated this. At about the same time that the Silent Sentinels were taking up their stations back in January of 1917, Carrie Chapman Catt submitted a very public offer of assistance to President Wilson in the event that the United States would enter the war. The suffragists, said Catt, could recruit soldiers and raise money. They had proven quite good at all of this already. President Wilson very publicly thanked Mrs. Catt and complimented her on creating so resilient an organization dedicated to suffrage. He went a step further a month later, congratulating the suffragists on their victory in North Dakota, and then declaring that he was a friend to women's suffrage. Carrie Chapman Catt continued to foster good relations and to trumpet the victories of her organization, including New York, which approved women's suffrage in March, just before news of the Zimmermann telegram leaked to the press. When the House of Representatives passed a war resolution on April 6, 1917, Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt was there again, taking up headlines. Over the next several months, suffragists were all over the news. They delivered recruiting pamphlets. They raised money. The suffragists stood in solidarity with the young soldiers and the American people in wartime. Well, almost all of the suffragists. All throughout February and March and April, the Silent Sentinels kept up their posts. When war broke out, they kept up their posts. When the Antis began calling them out for disloyalty, they kept their posts. Mrs. Catt's efforts had won presidential support for the national amendment. Wilson was now deliberately calling upon the House of Representatives to appoint a committee to report out a suffrage amendment. Still, the Silent Sentinels kept their posts. On June 20th, Woodrow Wilson received a delegation from Russia, an ally in the newly declared war against the Germans. The delegation called upon the White House and had to pass by the banners of the militant suffragists, this time holding a banner 10 feet long that read, "To the Russian mission, President Wilson is deceiving you. He says we are a democracy." But America is not a democracy. 20 million American women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement. Help us make this nation really free. Tell our government it must liberate people before it can claim free Russia as an ally. Not quite a pithy slogan, but effective. The Russian delegation probably could not read it, given how fast their motorcade passed through the gates. But the crowd that gathered to see the foreign dignitaries enter did see it. A murmur went up from the crowd. People began shouting. An engineer, a young man named Walter, called shame upon the suffragists. "We have to give our sons to the service of this country," he said, "and now we are confronted by outrageous statements at the very White House gates." Women were in the crowd. One shouted, "Why don't you take that banner to Berlin?" And another yelled, "You are helping Germany." Imputations of aiding and abetting the enemy during wartime are serious and were to be taken seriously. Secret Service agents emerged from the White House and took up positions in the crowd. A policeman took the time to scrawl down the message from the banner and almost got the message down before the crowd, led by Walter the engineer, tore the banner from the silent sentinels. The sentinels retreated and returned with their old signs, which would ask President Wilson what he had done for suffrage. Their vigil would continue silently, but the condemnation came swiftly. Congressmen who had been friendly to women's suffrage doubted if they could raise any support now, and Carrie Chapman Catt suffragists denounced Alice Paul and the silent sentinels in the press. For her part, Alice Paul gave an immediate statement to the press saying that her party had ordered a new banner with the same inscription. And, true to her word, they were back at the gates with that same banner the next day. And again, they were attacked by the crowd and their banner was destroyed. They returned again and were this time arrested by the Washington police. They would all be sentenced to 3 days in jail for obstructing the sidewalk. The suffragists went to jail, but they came back 3 days later in force, this time for an Independence Day celebration on July 4th. President Wilson wasn't present. He was yachting on the Potomac. Silent sentinels were treated roughly by the crowd. One man, identified in the police reports as John Jones, called the women idiots, stepped forward, and tore down their banners. This brazen act of violence and of attacking women moved the crowd. Some may have shouted approval, but some men demanded that John Jones stop. The police arrived and immediately arrested all of the suffragists, preparing to take them in, this time on charges of unlawful assembly. 2 men stepped forward and asked the policemen why John Jones was not arrested, and they offered to testify. But the police ignored them, arrested the suffragists, and took them away. The swift arrival of the police disappointed many in the crowd who had looked forward to more of a show. They milled around a bit and then dispersed, most of them without seeing the second company of militant suffragists who marched in, arriving to take up their posts with new banners. John Jones saw them. He returned. The crowd that remained egged him on, and he ripped down the second set of signs. Now the police stepped in again, arresting the new company of silent sentinels and John Jones for good measure. John Jones was denied bail at the police station. The militant suffragists refused to post bail, so everybody stayed in jail that night. The silent sentinels would be released a few days later, and they returned with new pickets before the month of July was over. By now, the police had had it with them, and they were arrested on the spot. The judge gave them 60-day sentences on July 18th, but President Wilson surprised everyone by issuing the suffragists unconditional pardons the following day. Not to be cowed, the militants resumed their pickets a day later. Among the banners they carried was one that read, "We ask not pardon for ourselves, but justice for all American women." The persistence of the militants must have been impressive, as was their stiff upper lip in the face of physical and verbal abuse from the crowds. But what was the value of the pickets? The Senate Committee on Women's Suffrage issued a negative report on suffrage on August the 2nd, with several committee members directly citing the pickets as reason for their refusal to support a national amendment for women's suffrage. A week later, the militants had an audience before the Senate. Congress had just passed the Espionage Act and was considering passage of a sedition bill. They were at the beginning of a chilling chapter in America's history of free speech. That's a lecture for another time. But suffice it to say that the sedition bill would have criminalized any criticism of the United States government. The Espionage Act already had a rather vague clause in it that made aiding the enemy a crime, and the pickets, many said, did in fact aid the enemy. The senators who addressed the silent sentinels minced no words. They accused the militant suffragists of disloyalty. "Disloyal," replied Mrs. Abby Baker, the publicity director of the Woman's Party. "The president says we're fighting for the democracy of the world. It's lack of democracy at home that is embarrassing the administration in its fight for democracy in Europe. Let some of this democracy be passed on to women who feel they ought to have a voice in the nation's affairs." Miss Catherine Moray made the case for democratic protest. "Our pickets," she said, "have done more real service to the country. They have awakened the spirit of democracy." One suffragist shook her gloved fist at the panel. "Let me tell you, President Wilson has taken on his shoulders the burden of dishonoring liberty in the nation's capital. The cause of liberty for which he is asking men to give their lives in Europe, why not give some of this liberty for women?" The hearing ended when the senators asked the women to draft some language protecting the act of picketing that might be added to the federal sedition bill. But as the women turned to leave, the chair of the committee told the room that the suffragists' personal attacks upon the president were out of line and would be stricken from the record. The militants cast angry glances back at the panel as they turned to go. The very next day, they showed up to the White House with new banners inscribed with, "Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they are not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye." Enough was enough. Senators called for anti-picket laws. The people clamored for treason prosecutions. They almost got them. Suffragists were arraigned on trumped-up charges of unlawful assembly and disturbing the peace, and given sentences up to 6 months. Public sentiment was turning deeply and darkly against women's suffrage. It did not help that the sole member of Congress to vote against the resolution for war was also Congress's only woman member, Janine Rankin of Montana. It did not help that socialists were openly working to thwart the war effort, including female lecturer Kate Richards O'Hare, who would be arrested and prosecuted for her efforts. In the face of this, Carrie Chapman Catt remained steady and calm. Behind the scenes, she continued to direct her organization to lobby congressmen for the national ballot. Publicly, she renounced the silent sentinels and called for unity for the war effort. Her calm but relentless action kept suffragists on the right side of the public perception of the war effort, if on the wrong side of the pacifists and the socialists, who had been their allies on the progressive left. Meanwhile, the militants in jail drew an attention of another kind. The press had reported rough conditions in prison. Word leaked that several were leading a hunger strike. Prison officials ordered a force feeding. As women left the jails, they swore affidavits attending to their abysmal conditions. Blankets were withheld at night. "Pay your fine," the warden had told them, "and you can get blankets." There had been no hunger strike, some others said. They had simply refused to eat worm-infested food. A delegation of senators visited and viewed their condition. One murmured, "What did those women do to deserve this?" Moderate suffragists could now continue to distance themselves from militants' tactics while expressing outrage over the militants' treatment. Were they not, after all, political prisoners? Were they not, after all, women? Carrie Chapman Catt continued to directly lobby behind the scenes. Members of Congress heard about the women's poor treatment, which was having its effect on public sentiment. Woodrow Wilson, desiring more allies and public unity, now openly embraced the suffragists' cause as a war measure. Congress would go on to finally pass the 19th Amendment in 1919, and it was sent to the states. But neither the militants nor the moderates gave up the pressure. The pickets stayed up at the White House. With ratification steadily progressing into 1920, suffragists organized delegations to attend Democratic and Republican national conventions. Already having the suffrage in a number of states, the women demanded planks supporting ratification of the Women's Suffrage Amendment. At the GOP convention in Chicago, militants picketed with banners that read, "Vote against the Republican Party as long as it blocks suffrage." Alice Paul gave statements to the press. But no longer a pariah, she received a delegation from the Republican Party and assurances for support of suffrage as well. A week later in San Francisco, suffragists pressured the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson may have been a friend to suffrage and may have helped them to get the national amendment out the congressional door, but, what have you done for me lately? 35 states had ratified by June 21, 1920. Tennessee, currently considering ratification, would make it 36. Tennessee was a Democratic state. If Democrats did not use their influence in Tennessee to reach the requisite 36 states, the threshold for ratification, then women promised to bolt and form a third party. All eyes were on Tennessee. Sue S. White, the Tennessee chairman of the National Woman's Party, sent a telegram to her allies at the Democratic National Convention. Tennessee, she said, was ripe for the picking, and the support was there. In a key move, the militants publicly laid off the pressure of Tennessee politicians, and the Democratic politicians delivered. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee ratified. Politics is a long game. Carrie Chapman Catt knew that, and she played it to win when she took over the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1915. She never flagged in her zeal, and her perfect machine did its work. Alice Paul was more impatient. She brought youth and militancy to the women's movement. She and her compatriots may have done some initial damage to the cause with their provocative pickets, but even if impatient, nobody could accuse them of being fleeting. Having demonstrated their willingness to stand in freezing weather, to submit to the scorn of crowds, to endure harsh treatment in jail, no one could doubt their resolve. 100 years later, we should remember the women who fought for suffrage. We should remember that they did not always agree with one another. They worked sometimes at cross purposes. But they were relentless, and their efforts helped convince us, 100 years later, that women's suffrage was indeed inevitable.